Jews in Israel today are less safe than anywhere else in the world. But it's much, much worse than that, because Israel generates anti-Semitism. Israel is responsible for the upsurge of hostility towards Jews everywhere.
The Israeli state and its supporters have a clear narrative. All Jews have a stake in Israel. All Jews are represented by Israel. And regardless of where they live or how they feel about Israel, Israel is the ultimate guarantee of Jewish safety. But this week's guest argues that this isn't and has never been true. Historian and author Avi Shlaim was born in Baghdad in 1945. His family had lived in Iraq for literally millennia, and they considered themselves just as Arab as their Muslim and Christian neighbours did. The foundation of the State of Israel changed all that, and in Shlaim's view, for the worse. We talk about how Israel has warped and reduced Jewish identity, the hypocrisy of left-wing Zionists, and Mossad's secret bombing campaign against Iraqi Jews. I learned a lot from this interview, and I hope you do too. Avi Shlaim, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, Ash.
So, my first question is, before 1948, in broad terms, how would you describe the experience and culture of Arab Jews living in the Middle East?
Before the emergence of the State of Israel in 1948, there was a large number of Jews living in the Arab world, something like 800,000 Jews. And there were Jews in Lebanon, in Syria, in Egypt, and Iraq, where I come from. In Iraq, there were 135,000 Jews before the establishment of the State of Israel, and then nearly all of them ended up in Israel reluctantly. But there were Jewish communities throughout the Arab world. The Jewish community in Iraq was the most ancient, going back to 2.5 millennia ago. It was the most prosperous, the most successful, and the best integrated into local society. So this was something that completely changed the face of the Middle East. Today, we have complete and stark division. There is Israel on one side and Arabs on the other side. But before 48, there were Jews throughout the Arab world, and Muslim-Jewish coexistence was not a distant dream. It was the everyday reality. And my book, 3 Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew, has aroused a lot of interest in the Arab world, because young Arabs, not so young, any Arabs born after 1948 would have no idea. They would have a clue that the face of the Middle East was totally different. The Jews and Arabs lived side by side until the arrival of Zionism and the establishment of the Jewish state, which was a real a point of real division and polarization in the area.
You talked about the coexistence between Muslims and Jews in the Arab world before 1948. To make it tangible, in terms of things like food, socializing, music, even mixed relationships, what was the kind of cultural glue holding people together?
The language was a glue, a very important factor. My family and I, we were Arab Jews. We spoke Arabic at home. We didn't speak any other language. Our culture was Arab culture. Our food was the most delicious, spicy Middle Eastern food. It wasn't European food. My parents' music was a very, very nice blend of Jewish and Arabic music. So in every sense of the word, we were Arab Jews. We were Iraqis whose religion happened to be Judaism, and there were Iraqis whose religion was Muslim, and there were Iraqis whose religion was Christian. But we were all Iraqis, and we were united by that. Furthermore, we Arab Jews had much more in common, linguistically and culturally, with non-Jews around us. We had much more in common with them than we had with Jews in Eastern Europe.
And when you say had a more in common with the non-Jewish neighbours in the Arab world versus Eastern European Jews, what were the differences culturally between Arab Jews and Eastern European Jews?
In Europe, the Jews were the other, in inverted commas. The Jews stood out. Europe had a Jewish problem. Germany had a Jewish problem. Adolf Hitler thought he had a solution to the Jewish problem. Iraq did not have a Jewish problem. Iraq had a lot of minorities. It had Christians, Chaldeans, Assyrians, Turkomans, Circassians, Jews, a lot of minorities. And the Jews were one minority among many. And they were treated no better and no worse than the other minorities. And there was a long tradition of religious tolerance between the different minorities. In Iraq, the Jews did not live in ghettos. They lived everywhere with the rest of society. And anti-Semitism is a European malady. Anti-Semitism grew in Europe, and from Europe it was exported to the Middle East. And one proof of that claim is that there was no literature in Arabic, anti-Semitic literature in Arabic. So when there was when anti-Semitism took off in Iraq after the First World War, anti-Semitic literature had to be translated from European languages to Arabic, literature like Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. So that's the difference, that we felt at home, we were treated as locals in the Arab world, whereas in Europe, the Jews were always a separate class of people and a problematic class. And it took Europe much, much longer than the Arab world to start treating the Jews as co-citizens. And even before the Jews got full rights in the Arab world, at least they were citizens. They were second-class citizens, but it was much, much better than the status of the Jews in Europe. And it took Europe much, much longer to come to terms with the fact that Jews are ordinary human beings who deserve equal rights.
Can I play devil's advocate for a second? There are people who would listen to this and would maybe say, aren't you looking back with rose-tinted glasses? There's anti-Semitism in Islamic texts. There's anti-Semitism which is, core to the Muslim identity. I don't think that. I'm Muslim. But many would say that, in particular, Israel's advocates. How would you respond to that accusation?
I would respond by saying that you can always find quotations to support your point of view. And you can always pick some lines in the Quran and say this is proof of anti-Semitism. But to counter that, there are so many quotations in the Quran that are not only not anti-Semitic, but the opposite. And in general, in Islam, the Jews are treated with respect. They are Ahl al-Kitab, they are the people of the book. And so are Christians, incidentally. They're also the people of the book, and they're treated with great respect. So you can always find selective quotations to argue whatever you like. Another variant of this argument, for which you play devil's advocate, is that Islam is incompatible with democracy. And you can find quotations to suggest that. But if you look seriously and objectively at Islamic scriptures, at the Quran, you'll have to conclude that there is nothing in Islam which is incompatible with democracy. And this is if you look at it objectively, and I define objectivity as uncritical acceptance of my views.
That's so funny. That's how I define objectivity too.
My wife defines objectivity as male subjectivity.
I think she's right. When did the status of Arab Jews begin to change? Was it with the emergence of Zionism in Europe? Was it the Arab Revolt? Or was it the 1948 establishment of the State of Israel?
It's a gradual process, and it's difficult to put your finger on one particular date. But in the aftermath of the First World War, Britain sponsored the Zionist movement. And so one key date is the Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which Britain pledged support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This was a classic colonial document which completely disregarded the rights and aspirations of the local people. In 1917, the Arabs were 90% of the population, the Jews were 10%, and the Jews owned 2% of the land. And yet Britain, the colonial power, chose to privilege the Jews over the Arabs. And I've written a lot about the history of the British mandate in Palestine from 1920 to 1948. But I can summarize it for your listeners in one sentence, which is that Britain stole Palestine from the Palestinians and gave it to the Zionists. That's why resentment of the Zionist movement started to build up, not just in Palestine, where the Arabs were being displaced by the Zionist project, but throughout the Arab world. There was real sympathy for the Palestinians, and there is still strong sympathy for the Palestinians throughout the Arab world today. And I'm not talking about governments, I'm talking about people. So that was one factor that changed. And the Jews in Iraq were associated with Britain, the colonial power. And because Britain was responsible for the displacement of the Palestinians from Palestine by the Zionists, that fed into hostility towards the local Jews. Then the other turning point is 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel and the First Arab-Israeli War. This is when ethnic cleansing happened. This is when Israel expelled 750,000 Arabs. They became refugees. More than half the Palestinian population became refugees, and the name Palestine was wiped off the map. This is the Nakba. It had repercussions throughout the region. The Iraqi army fought in the war for Palestine. At the end of the war, Israel signed armistice agreements with all its neighbors. These are the only internationally recognized borders that Israel has ever had, and they are the only borders that I recognize as legitimate. This is the pre-1967 borders. Iraq did not sign an armistice agreement with Israel. The Iraqi army withdrew from Palestine, and Iraq is still officially at war with Israel. It's in the aftermath of this war that there was an upsurge of hostility towards the local Jews in Iraq and elsewhere throughout the Arab world. And there was popular hostility towards the Zionists, but also there was hostility at the official level. The Iraqi government began persecuting the Jews in Iraq. The whole climate change, Jews were fired from government service. Restrictions were placed on the activities of Jewish merchants and Jewish financiers. Quotas were imposed on the number of Jews who could go to universities and medical schools. So this was a real turning point in Muslim-Jewish relations in Iraq.
In a way, you stop being Iraqi and you start becoming Israelis who are living in Iraq in the eyes of the government.
This is absolutely right in a nutshell. And I have a remote relative. He was a writer, Yitzhak Bar Moshe. He moved to Israel. In Israel, he wrote 10 books, all in Arabic. And one of them is called Al-Khuruj min al-Iraq, the exodus or the departure from Iraq. And he says, we left Iraq as Jews, and we arrived in Israel as Iraqis. But it's Israel that made all the difference, because Zionism gave the Jews a territorial dimension for the first time in 2 millennia. Now, Zionism created a Jewish state in Palestine. Anyone in the Arab world who didn't like Jews, anyone like the Istiqlal Party, the right-wing party in Iraq, which was very anti-Jewish, and any anti-Semite could say to the Jews, you don't belong here. You're not from here. You are alien. And why don't you go and join your brothers in Palestine? So the whole attitude towards the local Jews changed. And the Jewish community in Iraq, which had contributed to nation building at every level, changed, or the perception of this community changed, and from being a constructive pillar of Iraqi society, it was viewed increasingly as a fifth column.
How was the Nakba understood by Jews living in the diaspora, particularly in the Arab world? How did they think about it?
1948 was a very, very anxious time for the Jews in the diaspora and in the Arab world, because whatever they felt about Zionism, they were now seen as implicated in what was going on in Palestine. And Zionism was a movement by European Jews for European Jews, which had very little appeal to Arab Jews. And the Zionist movement the Zionist leaders had no interest in the Jews of the Arab countries. They tended to look down on them as no better than Arabs, as primitive, as backward. What changed that was the Holocaust. The Holocaust removed the main reservoir for Jews for the Jewish state to be. And it's only then that Zionist leaders began to look for Jews from all four corners of the earth, including the Arab world. So the attitude of the Zionist movement towards Arab Jews changed. and now Arab Jews who had no interest in Israel were felt unwelcome, unsafe, and many of them ended up in Israel. My mother used to wax lyrical about the wonderful Muslim friends that we had in Baghdad. And one day I said to her, "Did we have any Zionist friends?" And she looked at me as if this was a very peculiar question. And she said to me, "No, Zionism is an Ashkenazi thing. It's nothing to do with us."
And so that ethnic stratification of Jews, so Sephardic Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, Mizrahi Jews, what kind of impact does that have in contemporary Israeli society? Because I don't think all of these terms will be that familiar to our audience.
Ashkenazi Jews are the Jews of Europe and North America, by and large, and Sephardi Jews are the Jews of the Middle East, North Africa and the Middle East, and some countries in Eastern Europe, like Bulgaria as well. The name Sephardi comes from Sfarad, which is Spain. And the name Sephardim comes from the Jews who were expelled from Spain and Portugal in 1942. And from Spain and Portugal,
1492.
1492.
I was going to be like Christopher Columbus in 1942. I didn't do a history GCSE. But...
Well done. Thank you for the correction. So the Jews were expelled in 1492 from the Iberian Peninsula, and they wandered, they settled down in North Africa and in the Middle East, and they're called Sephardim. Now, Israel was created in 1948, and all the Jews from Arab countries who ended up in Israel are called Mizrahim. Mizrah in Hebrew means east, so Eastern Jews, and that's a collective term from Jews wherever they came from in the Arab world, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Lebanon, wherever. And this is a common term, Mizrahim, for all Jews of Arab origins.
Because Jabotinsky, who, as I understand it, was an early Zionist, he wrote, "We Jews have nothing in common with what is denoted the East, and we thank God for that." When the image of the Zionist Jew is completely antithetical to what it means to be Arab, even if you're an Arab Jew, what did that mean for Arab Jews in Israel?
So Jabotinsky was the spiritual father of the Israeli right, and in 1923 he wrote an article, "The Iron Wall, We and the Arabs," and this is the Bible of Zionist foreign policy. It was in two parts, an analysis of the problem and a solution. The problem was that the Zionists wanted to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. Jabotinsky said, "The Arabs are not a rabble, they are a people. No people in history has ever willingly made way for another people to come and build a state on their land, and therefore Arab opposition to Zionism is inevitable and inescapable. So what do? His answer was to build an iron wall of Jewish military strength. The Arabs would knock their head against the rampart. Eventually they'll give up the hope of defeating the Jews, the Zionists, on the battlefield, and then will come the time for negotiations with the local Arabs about the rights and status in Palestine." So that was Jabotinsky, a strategy in two stages. first build up military force and then negotiations from strength with the Arabs. The trouble with Netanyahu and the people like him and the more extreme right-wing Zionists in Israel and the religious Zionists in Israel today is that they only understood the first part of the strategy, building up military force in order to subdue the Arabs indefinitely, rather than negotiate from strength as a political solution to what is a political problem. So there's one other point about Jabotinsky and all the other Zionist founding fathers, Theodor Herzl, Chaim Weizmann, and it was the orientation on the West. They all didn't saw the Jews as not being part of the Middle East, and they didn't want to integrate into the region. They saw Israel, they saw the Jewish state as an outpost of Western colonialism. And Jabotinsky is a classic example of that. He said, we have nothing in common with the Arabs, and thank God for that. But he also said, we will man the ramparts of the West against Eastern barbarism. And that tells you something about the Zionist movement and its geopolitics, that the emphasis was not on finding modus vivendi with the local Arabs. The emphasis was always on having the support of the great powers.
So first the British Empire,
Yes.
and now the American
Yes.
Empire. Has there ever been a strain within Israeli politics who have wanted to turn away from the great powers of the West and remake Israel as something which is more integrated with its Arab neighbours? Or does that just not really exist as a distinct political trend?
It was a distinct Jewish school of political thought about the conflict. But this was the big issue. This was the big question, that in the land of the aspirations of the Zionists, another people already lived. So what do you do about them? Jabotinsky had one solution: build up military force and squeeze them out. But there was a moderate strand in Jewish political thought in Palestine, which advocated coexistence and a binational state. The president of the Hebrew University, Dr. Judah Magnes, was one leader. The philosopher Martin Buber was another leader of a movement which was called Ichud, unity, which advocated a binational state. But this was overtaken by events in 1948, when Israel used military force very effectively to cut through the Gordian knot. And after that, we don't see, it's only a marginal group of Canaanites who are not Israeli nationalists, who want to go back to the original land of Canaan and define their cultural identity as Canaanite. But this is not a significant political movement.
Is there a sort of double-facedness to the way in which the Zionist project has positioned and thought of Arab Jews? Because on the one hand, it's very Ashkenazi, as you said, but on the other hand, Arab Jews and the cultural identity of Arab Jews, whether that's food, whether that's names, it lends a kind of indigeneity to the Zionist project. So Arab Jews might be looked down upon, but also at the same time, they're seen as a very authentic expression of what it means to be an Israeli.
Yeah, indeed. And one positive recent trend is that Arab Jews, or the descendants of Arab Jews, are very proud of the Arab heritage and of their folklore and culture. And I say the descendants of Arab Jews because all Israelis born since 1948 are not strictly speaking Arab Jews. I'm an Arab Jew because I lived in Baghdad before Israel was established. But the Mizrahim, the descendants of the Arab Jews, are more than half the population in Israel. But most of the elites, the political, the military, the culture, certainly the cultural elites, they're overwhelmingly Ashkenazi, and there is still a tendency among the elite to look down on the Mizrahim in Israel. And I would have liked Israel to become part of its environment, to integrate into the region. And therefore, I had hopes that the Arab Jews would become a bridge between Israel and the Arab world. But the Ashkenazi elite never wanted a bridge to the Arab world, and therefore the Arab Jews the Mizrahim, never fulfilled that function in Israeli society.
Isn't there also a problem of trying to see the Mizrahim as a bridge between Israel and the Arab world when Palestinians are denied their political rights, the right to self-determination, the right to land, the right of return? Because you can't both be, I guess, proud of an Arab identity and integrated with your Arab neighbors if at the same time you believe in a project of Jewish supremacy on a territory that Palestinians also have the right to call home.
That is a very, very real problem for Arab Jews. And the great majority of Mizrahim resolve it by becoming Israelis, by overcompensating, by becoming more right-wing, more Arab-spurning than most Ashkenazim.
It's sort of like the more English than the English thing.
More English than the English. Or in America, the equivalent would be poor white people who become American nationalists and look down on the Arabs. So that is true of the Mizrahim in Israel. To establish their credentials as Israeli patriots, they adopt strong anti-Arab positions. But that isn't true of all Mizrahim. The left-wing Mizrahim who identify with the Palestinians, the Iraqi Jewish writers in Israel who drew parallels between their displacement in 1948, their Nakba, and our displacement from our homeland. Ella Shohat, who is a very eminent cultural critic at the University of New York University, is of Iraqi origins. She's Israeli, and she has written a really important book called On the Arab Jew, Palestine, and Arab Displacements. And she makes an explicit parallel between the displacement of the Palestinians from Palestine, what we were talking about earlier, the Nakba, the expulsion of 750,000 Arabs, and something like 800,000 Jews left the Arab world to go to Israel. They went to Israel because they had no choice. They couldn't go anywhere else. But there is a difference. There is the theory of the double exodus, that it was a population exchange, but it wasn't, because the Palestinians were driven out by force by the Zionist movement. We were not mistreated. we were not pushed out. Life became uncomfortable and unsafe for us, and therefore we moved to Israel. But there are parallels, and Israeli communists, for example, always made a common cause with the Palestinians who remained inside Israel.
I want to just quickly come back to Jabotinsky, because it was the first time I ever read The Iron Wall was in preparation for this interview. And what was striking to me is that I obviously disagree with his morality, but he was very clear-sighted and in a way humanized the Arabs when he said, look, it's perfectly natural. They're going to resist our attempt to build a Jewish state on top of them. I think it's morally justified to do that, but they're not a rabble. And what he also didn't say is that they'd be motivated by anti-Semitism of any kind. He just said, no, this is settler colonial relations, explicitly called the Zionist project a settler colonial project. Now, not only is that unsayable within political circles, it's also seen as anti-Semitic to say it's a settler colonial project, or that maybe it's natural for Palestinians to want to resist their displacement or the ongoing occupation. How do you account for that change or that cognitive dissonance among Zionists, that the early leaders, spiritual leaders, the founding thinkers were saying, yes, this is a settler colonial project, and now Israel's advocates will come down like a ton of bricks on you if you make that suggestion public?
I'm glad you said that about Jabotinsky, because I'm left-wing. He was very right-wing, but I respect him because he was honest, because he admitted that there is a problem, that we are trying to take over somebody else's land, and the only way to do it is by force. And he had a lot of Labour Zionists who criticized him, and they said, no, this is immoral. And he wrote a second article on the morality of the Iron Wall.
I think he called them vegetarians, didn't he?
Vegetarians, that's right. Because they recoiled from the use of force, they said, we are completely defensive. We wouldn't use military force. And he said, but there is no other way. And so he called a spade, whereas the Labour Zionists were hypocritical. They refused to admit that there was a problem, and they refused to admit that their aim was to take over the land and its resources and to ethnically cleanse the local population. So there was always a huge gap between the lofty rhetoric of the Zionist movement and the reality of how the Zionists treated the Arabs on the ground. And Zionist leaders from that time until today fill this gap with hypocrisy and humbug. But I exempt Jabotinsky from this charge of hypocrisy. I applied mostly to Labour Zionists.
I want to move on a little bit. It's often said by Zionists, even non-Jewish Zionists, that without Israel, there's no safety for Jews. Am I right in suggesting that your thinking is the opposite, that Israel has made the Jewish diaspora a lot less safe?
Yes, that is my view, and that is the reality if you look around you. Israel today is the least safe place for Jews in the world. And since the beginning of the war in Gaza 8 months ago, 300,000 Israelis have been displaced, some internally, but many of them have left the country because it's unsafe. And it's unsafe on two fronts. In the south, because of the war in Gaza, but also in the north, because the border war between Israel and Hezbollah. So there's no question that Jews in Israel today are less safe than anywhere else in the world. But it's much, much worse than that. It's much worse than that because Israel generates anti-Semitism. Israel is responsible for the upsurge of hostility towards Jews everywhere in the world. And we see it very acutely in Britain today. The Community Security Trust, which is a Jewish organization, collects data, and its data shows that every time Israel has launched a military offensive in Gaza, there's been an upsurge of anti-Semitic incidents in this country. So there is a direct correlation between Israel's actions against the Palestinians and rising hostility towards the Jews in this country and elsewhere. And it's undeniable that there is anti-Semitism in this country. It's a serious problem, and it's a growing problem. But what causes this? We have to ask ourselves, what is the reason for the increase of anti-Semitic incidents in this country? And the answer is that Israel is responsible for the upsurge of anti-Semitism. And British Jews are in a dilemma because Israel is a central component of their identity. So they identify with Israel, and they find it difficult to acknowledge that Israel is responsible for the hostile, increasingly hostile climate that they face in this country. And my advice to British Jews is that they're British. They don't have to identify with Israel. They don't have to support Israel. They don't have to cling to the attitude of my country, right or wrong. And Jews are not collectively responsible for Israel's actions. And a growing number of Jews in this country and in America and elsewhere are dissociating themselves from Israel. I belong to a number of these groups, Independent Jewish Voices, Jews for Justice for Palestinians, the Jewish Voice for Labor in the Labour Party, Free Speech on Israel. And all of these people are saying, not in our name. Israel doesn't represent us. We are Jews, and Israel is a country which is doing terrible things. Today, it's carrying out genocide in Gaza. So it's really, really important to distinguish between Jews on the one hand, the people, and Israel, which is a country.
So, devil's advocate again. I've seen anti-Zionist Jews being accused of being self-hating Jews, that there is some guilt, there's some shame, and you reject a core part of your identity. How do you respond to that accusation?
It's complete rubbish, and I'm not going to respond to this. The anti-Zionists give rational reasons, evidence-based reasons for the criticism of Israel. So why attribute very honest, well-grounded comments and criticisms of what Israel is doing with self-hating? I'm a Jew, and I'm not a self-hating Jew. I'm a student of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and I try to be honest about what is going on. And Israel is definitely in the wrong. So really, this view, this notion of self-hating Jews is beneath contempt.
Well, I'll let certain journalists on Twitter know. Just moving on a bit, in your book, 3 Worlds, which really is fascinating, because at first I thought I was reading an autobiography and a personal history, and then as I continued, I realized I was reading a social history. In this book, you uncover evidence that suggests that the Israeli Mossad used certain methods to motivate Jews to leave Iraq. What was the evidence that you uncovered, and how did they motivate Jews to leave Iraq between 1948 and the 1950s?
Big picture first. In 1950, there were 135,000 Jews in Iraq. By the end of 1952, there were only about 10,000 Jews left in Iraq. The whole community had been wiped out.
In 2 years?
Yes, in 2 years. And 125,000 Jews ended up in Israel. In March 1950, the Iraqi government passed a law which said, the Iraqi parliament passed a law which said, any Jew who wants to leave the country is free to do so. They have a year to register to leave on a one-way visa. And not many Jews registered to leave. And in the next year, 5 bombs exploded in Jewish premises in Baghdad, and that created a panic and that helped to precipitate the exodus to Israel. And there were always rumors that the Mossad was involved in the bombs. I was always fascinated by this question since I was a boy. And now, when researching this book, I found 2 sources of evidence that point to Mossad connection. One is that I interviewed a very elderly friend of my mother's in Ramat Gan, Yaakov Karkukli, who was in the Zionist underground in Baghdad. And he told me about their actions, what they did, how they organized illegal immigration, and then after the law I just mentioned, legal immigration to Israel, how they forged documents, how they paid bribes. But most importantly, he told me that one of his colleagues, Yosef Basri, a 28-year-old lawyer and an ardent Zionist, he was a member of the underground, and he was responsible for 3 out of the 5 bombs. And in my research, I established that one hand grenade was lobbed by a young activist in the Istiklal party, which wanted to expel the Jews from Iraq and confiscate the properties. And another hand grenade was lobbed into the Mas'ud Shem Tov synagogue, and there 4 people were killed. And he was a criminal who had a grudge against the Jews, and it had nothing to do with the Mossad. But 3 other bombs, the Zionist activists, specifically Yosef Basri, were responsible for them. And the controller of Basri was an Israeli intelligence officer called Max Binet. He gave him the orders, he gave him the TNT. Basri was caught, tried, a proper trial, not a show trial, and convicted and hanged. And so that's one source of evidence, oral evidence, which is, we all know, is not totally reliable. The other source of evidence is a Baghdad police report, 1 page, from the investigation of Basri and his colleagues, which names names and says specifically what Basri said in the interrogation. And so I now have written evidence as well as oral evidence that Israeli intelligence officers were involved in the planting of bombs in Baghdad on Jewish sites. Now, my Zionist critics said that even if I was right, even if all this is true, the main reason for the exodus was not the bombs, it was persecution by the government. And I concede that. It's not part of my argument that the bombs were the main reason for the liquidation of this community. But my answer to my Zionist critics is, even if I knew for certain that not a single Iraqi Jew left Iraq to go to Israel because of the bombs, I would still think this is a real indictment of the state of Israel, because Israel was created to provide a safe haven for Jews, not to be harassing and threatening Jews in other countries.
When presented with this kind of evidence, how have Israeli Jews, in your experience, engaged with the idea that Mossad, intelligence agents, had a role in making Jews feel afraid for their lives in other countries?
When I was a boy in Israel, there were persistent rumors that Mossad had a hand in the bombs. And these rumors were persistently denied by the government. And there are two commissions of inquiry that exonerated Israel totally. But the rumors persisted. And this belief, right or wrong, that Israel had a hand in uprooting them, fed the hostility to the state of Israel, especially because they didn't have a very warm welcome on arrival. They arrived, and at the airport they were sprayed with DDT, with pesticide. They're treated like animals. So just try and imagine the experience of a Jew from an Arab country who arrives at the promised land, and the first thing he experiences is being sprayed with DDT.
It's a profound betrayal.
And a cultural aggression in your face, really, it's treating Arab Jews with contempt on arrival. So that's the formative experience. And then they are taken to transit camps. And in fairness to Israel, this is the early 50s, very poor country, limited resources, trying to recover from the trauma of the 1948 war. But all the same, these Jews were taken into transit camps, Ma'abarot, and everything is difficult for them. They've lost everything. They arrived in Israel with one suitcase and 50 dinars. That's all. So they are penniless, and they have no way out because they don't have a passport. The only place they could go to is Israel. And the managers of the transit camps are Ashkenazi Jews. They have no idea about the history of these people, their achievements, their status in the countries of origin. And they think they should be grateful for what they are getting. So it wasn't a very happy beginning for the Jews of the Arab lands who arrived in Israel in the early 1950s. Individual experiences differed. Some Jews did better than others. But for the Iraqi community as a whole, the experience was like that of a tree being pulled up by the roots. It was a very traumatic experience.
Can Zionists ever reconcile their belief in the need for a state of Israel with the existence of a thriving, culturally distinct and vibrant Jewish diaspora outside of Israel?
In theory, this should be perfectly possible because Israel is the country of the country of its citizens, and a fifth of the citizens happen to be Arab, but Israel is the country of all its citizens, whereas the Jews in the diaspora are not Israelis. If they are British Jews, they are British citizens. If they are French Jews, they are French citizens. The problem is that Israel claims to be this, not to be the state of the Jews. Israel claims to speak on behalf of all Jews everywhere. And as I was saying earlier, more and more Jews are saying, no, not in our name. We are not part of Israel. So it's Israel which is the problem with its claim to represent all Jews and to speak on behalf of Jews. It doesn't have such right. And there is another problem, and that is Israel befriends the worst anti-Semites around the world, like Viktor Orban in Hungary is a good example. And this goes back to what Herzl said, that the anti-Semites would be among our strongest supporters. Benjamin Netanyahu gets on really well with anti-Semites like Orban, like the Christian evangelists in America, with people like Donald Trump, who is anti-Semitic. He gets on really well with them. As long as they're pro-Israeli, he doesn't care. And the Israel lobby in America funds extreme right-wing Republicans, even if they're anti-Semitic, as long as they support Israel. So here you have another example in which there is a real difference and between Israel on the one hand and diaspora Jews on the other hand. And Israel now, by perpetrating the genocide in Gaza, Israel is doing lasting harm to the Jews of the world, harm that would last for 2 generations, because Israel is killing children, and killing children is unforgivable.
How does it feel as a Jewish person when you see the footage coming out of Gaza and what you hear from Netanyahu or even Joe Biden is that this is being done in the name of keeping Jews safe?
I think it's an absolutely preposterous argument, because Hamas attacked Israel on the 7th of October. It was a murderous attack, but Israel's response has been completely beyond outside the scale. And Israel, its response had to be within the limits of international humanitarian law. But the Israeli response has violated every item in international humanitarian law. So as a Jew, I feel deeply ashamed and angry about what Israel is doing. And I'm appalled that they speak as Jews, particularly the religious nationalists, the religious Zionists within the government, like Bezalel, Smotrich, and Itamar Ben-Gvir. They see themselves as Jews and they speak in the name of Jews, but they have nothing in common with me. And I'm not a practicing Jew, but I'm proud of my Jewish heritage, and I'm equally proud of my Arab heritage. And I know that the 4 core values of Judaism are altruism, truth, justice, and peace. And the Israeli government today is the antithesis of these core values. The core of Judaism is nonviolence. And look how violent this government is. And by my count, this is the 8th Israeli military offensive in Gaza. The first one was cast-led in 2008. This is the 8th, but it's out of all proportion to what has gone on before, because the aim is the destruction of Gaza, making Gaza unlivable, and the displacement of the people in Gaza, which is forcible displacement, which is a war crime. So Israel is committing a war crime every day. The aim is to depopulate Gaza, and there is a plan to depopulate Gaza. But now Israel has gone beyond ethnic cleansing to perpetrating genocide. And Israel has become a pariah in the last 8 months, a real international pariah. The whole of the global south is up in arms about what Israel is doing. And not only Israel is the victim of its own crimes, but the so-called rule-based international order. America and Britain claim to stand for the rule of law and for the rule-based international order, but their hypocrisy is exposed for everybody to see. Britain and America continue to supply weapons to Israel, and they continue to give diplomatic immunity to Israel. So Israel, because of its Western allies and support, uncritical support, is able to continue with their genocide. And some people hesitate to use the word genocide. I used to, but no longer. And the clincher for me is that Israel is stopping international aid, humanitarian aid, from reaching the starving people of Gaza. Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war. That is genocide.
I suppose I've got one final question, and it's about the possibilities of hybrid identity. Because listening to you talk, you seem most excited by the possibilities of Jewishness when it's combined with Arabness or Britishness and all these other kinds of ethnic, cultural, and religious expression. And it seems to me that part of your criticism of Israel is that it flattens Jewishness into just one thing. Am I right in saying that the thing that really excites you about Jewishness is its possibility to sit within a hybrid of lots of different kinds of identity?
Yes, and that is the main message of my memoirs. I try to recreate a unique Jewish civilization of the Near East, which flourished for generations, but was wiped out by the cold winds of nationalism in the 20th century. So that world no longer exists. And the real villain of this story is nationalism, because nationalism is a very negative and it's a very divisive and destructive force. Patriotism is different. Patriotism is love of your country. But for nationalism, you need an enemy. And as Marilyn Monroe wrote in her scrapbook, the trouble with nationalism is that it stops us thinking. It stops us relating to one another as human beings. And look at Israel and the religious Zionists in charge of Israel. They don't regard Arabs as human beings, not just the people in Gaza, but any Palestinians. They increasingly call them Nazis, and they demonize a whole people. And the trouble with demonizing people is it paves the way to genocide, which is what is happening in front of our eyes. So I had the privilege of living in an Arab country. I know I can relate to Arabs not just as the enemy, but as human beings. And in the epilogue to my book, and the narrative only goes up to when I was 18, but the epilogue traces the evolution of my thinking on Israel-Palestine up to the present. And I used to support a two-state solution, but Israel killed it, and therefore the solution that I advocate today is one democratic state from the river to the sea with equal rights for all the people who live there, regardless of religion and ethnicity.
Thank you so much, Avi Shlaim.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.